My son brought his new fiancée home for Thanksgiving dinner. She was polished, articulate, and seemed absolutely perfect. But halfway through the meal, my boy accidentally dropped his napkin. When he reached down, he deliberately flipped his coffee mug upside down on my old oak table. It was a silent signal we created when he was just a teenager. A code that meant, "Dad, I am in terrible trouble, and I cannot speak." Before I continue this story of how a single dinner turned into a psychological war, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to protect your family from a predator wearing a smile. My name is Douglas Wright. I am 65 years old. To anyone looking from the outside, I am just a quiet widower living out my retirement in a rustic cabin in the woods of upstate New York. I wear flannel shirts that have seen better days. I chop my own firewood to keep my joints moving, and I brew my coffee in a chipped ceramic pot. That is exactly the image I wanted the world to see. It is exactly the image I wanted my son Connor to see. I never burdened him with the truth of my 30 years working as a forensic auditor, quietly dismantling corporate fraud rings and international extortion syndicates for the federal government. I made my millions silently burying them in secure trusts and retired in the shadows so my boy could have a normal, untainted life. When Connor called to say he was bringing Vanessa to our Thanksgiving dinner, I was genuinely thrilled. He was 32, a brilliant but soft-hearted software developer who had always struggled to find the right partner. But the moment Vanessa stepped onto my porch, the air in my home shifted. She wore a tailored cashmere coat and pristine leather boots that practically sneered at my muddy welcome mat. She was undeniably beautiful, but her eyes scanned my cabin with the rapid, calculating precision of a real estate appraiser. Connor, my usually vibrant and confident son, looked like a ghost. His skin was unnaturally pale, his shoulders were hunched, and his eyes constantly darted toward her for approval before he spoke a single word. I served up a classic roasted turkey with homemade stuffing gravy and cranberry sauce. I poured the wine, playing the part of the gracious, simple host. Vanessa barely ate. She pushed the food around her plate with the tines of her fork, as if inspecting it for contamination. She laughed a high musical laugh that held absolutely no warmth, dominating the conversation, while Connor stared blankly at his plate. "Doug, this cabin is so charmingly quaint," she said, her voice dripping with condescension as she surveyed my living room. "It must be so incredibly difficult for a man your age to keep up with the maintenance all alone out here in the middle of nowhere. Have you ever considered that it might be time to downsize to a place with proper modern amenities? Perhaps an assisted living community where someone else can cook meals that are a bit more refined." Every phrase was a tiny poisoned needle stabbing at my independence. I kept my expression mild. I chewed my turkey, slowly leaning into the role of the harmless, slightly hard-of-hearing retiree she clearly thought I was. "I am doing just fine, Vanessa," I replied with a warm, oblivious smile. "The fresh air keeps my lungs strong, and the quiet keeps my mind sharp." Connor kept his gaze fixed on the tablecloth. "Yes, Dad is fine," he mumbled, his voice sounding hollow and entirely stripped of its usual warmth. Vanessa reached over and patted Connor's hand with fingers that looked like manicured claws. "Of course, honey," she cooed, her tone sickly sweet. "But we have to be realistic about his future. We have our own lives to build now. We cannot be tied down by unnecessary burdens." She stood up from the table, smoothing her designer skirt, and walked toward the hallway to inspect a collection of landscape paintings. She loudly critiqued the brushwork, making sure I could hear her dismissive sighs from the dining room. The moment her back was fully turned, Connor flinched. He purposefully shoved his cloth napkin off his lap, watching it flutter to the hardwood floor. As he bent down supposedly to retrieve it, his trembling hand shot out and grabbed his half-full coffee mug. He flipped it completely upside down on the oak table. Dark, hot coffee spilled across the polished wood, dripping steadily onto the floorboards. He did not look at me. He just grabbed his napkin and sat back up, his face completely devoid of blood. My chest tightened. Decades of hunting corporate sharks had trained my heart rate to remain steady under intense pressure. but seeing my own son execute our emergency protocol nearly broke my carefully constructed facade. When Connor was 16, he got mixed up with a bad crowd that tried to force him into a dangerous situation. I taught him the upside-down mug trick that very night. I told him if you are ever in a room where you are trapped, threatened, or simply cannot speak freely, flip a cup. I will ask no questions, and I will get you out safely. He had not used that signal in 16 years. I knew I could not react openly. Vanessa was a predator, and predators sense sudden shifts in behavior. I grabbed a kitchen towel, letting out a loud, exaggerated groan, typical of an old man with bad knees. "Oh, look at this mess," I chuckled, shuffling heavily over to his side of the table. "Let me get that, son." My hands are not as steady as they used to be either. Getting clumsy in my old age. I casually flipped the mug right side up, wiping the spilled coffee with a heavy-handed sweeping motion, hiding his desperate message beneath the guise of a senior citizen's accident. I thought I was fast enough, but as I tossed the stained towel onto the table, I caught a reflection in the antique hallway mirror. Vanessa had turned her head. She had seen the tail end of the exchange. Her sweet, polite smile completely vanished. For a fraction of a second, her face hardened into a mask of pure, calculating malice. It was the exact kind of look I had seen on cartel accountants just before a violent liquidation. The mask of a woman who realizes her control is being tested. She walked back into the dining room, her heels clicking sharply against the wood. The musical lilt was entirely gone from her voice. "Doug," she said, her tone flat and commanding. "You seem remarkably confused today. Spilling drinks, mishearing conversations. It is quite concerning for someone living in isolation." I blinked at her, adopting a look of mild, innocent bewilderment. "Oh, just a clumsy moment, my dear. Nothing to fuss over. We were just talking about the football game." "No, I insist," Vanessa countered, stepping dangerously close to my chair and looking down at me. Memory slips and loss of motor function are the first signs of rapid cognitive decline. I need to review your medication bottles right now. I am going to check your bathroom cabinet to ensure you are not slipping into dementia." Before I could utter a single word of protest, she turned on her heel and marched straight up the stairs toward my private quarters. I looked across the table at Connor. My son stared back at me, his eyes wide with a look of absolute, paralyzing terror. The heavy silence in the dining room was broken only by the rhythmic ticking of the antique grandfather clock in the corner. I sat there in my worn flannel shirt, staring across the table at the boy I had raised. Connor looked utterly broken. He kept his eyes locked on his cooling plate of turkey and stuffing. The air between us was thick with things unspoken. I could hear the sharp, deliberate click of Vanessa stepping onto the hardwood stairs. Her heels hit the steps with a measured cadence. It was not the casual wandering of a guest looking for a bathroom. It was the purposeful march of a predator securing her perimeter. I needed to know exactly what she was doing up there, but I could not break my character. To Connor, I was just an aging widower who was struggling to understand why his future daughter-in-law was being so rude. I let out a slow, tired sigh and slumped my shoulders further. I reached into the pocket of my slacks and wrapped my fingers around my smartphone. I kept my hand completely concealed beneath the edge of the table. Over 3 decades of tracking international embezzlers and phantom corporations had taught me that paranoia was just another word for adequate preparation. When I bought this rustic cabin, I spent an entire month wiring it with a military-grade surveillance grid. It was an entirely closed circuit system, completely invisible to any commercial scan. I knew the interface of the application by pure muscle memory. Without ever looking down or breaking my confused gaze, I unlocked the screen using my thumbprint. I swiped twice to the right and tapped the center of the glass to launch the security feed. Connor shifted uncomfortably in his chair. He opened his mouth as if he wanted to speak, but a slight creak from the floorboards above us made him snap his mouth shut. The fear radiating from my son was palpable. It made my blood run cold. I gave him a gentle, oblivious smile to reassure him that I suspected nothing. Meanwhile, my thumb navigated to the live feed for the second-floor hallway. I carefully slid the phone up just enough to glance at the screen while pretending to inspect a stain on my napkin. The high-definition color feed confirmed my suspicions immediately. Vanessa had completely bypassed the guest bathroom. She did not even glance at the medicine cabinet where my prescriptions were kept. Instead, she was walking straight toward the closed door of my private study. I watched her slide a slender device from her cashmere coat. With a few swift movements, she bypassed the simple lock on the study door. She moved with terrifying efficiency. This was not a greedy girlfriend snooping out of idle curiosity. This was a trained operative executing a targeted data breach. I switched the camera feed to the lens concealed inside the smoke detector of my study. Vanessa moved straight to my mahogany desk. She did not waste time rummaging through the drawers blindly. She knew exactly what to look for. I watched her pull out a stack of manila folders I kept in the bottom right drawer. These were my decoy files. They contained heavily sanitized bank statements, basic tax returns, and property records for the cabin. It was just enough financial data to paint the picture of a comfortable but modest retirement. My real wealth, the offshore trusts, the corporate bonds, and the heavily encrypted digital assets were locked in a server vault, buried beneath the basement floor. She pulled a small, high-resolution camera from her pocket. It was not a normal cell phone. It was a dedicated document scanner. I watched the screen intently as she began photographing every single page of my tax returns. Her movements were rhythmic and practiced. Turn the page, snap a photo. Turn the page, snap a photo. She made sure to capture the account numbers, the routing details, and the property identification codes. She was building a comprehensive financial profile to steal my identity, or to drain what she assumed was my entire life savings. A cold, calculated anger settled deep into my chest. I had spent my entire professional career putting people exactly like her in federal prison. I knew her type. They isolate the vulnerable target, they extract the financial data, and they leverage it to destroy families. She had chosen the wrong family. But I could not let her know that yet. I slid my phone back into my pocket and slowly stood up from the table. I groaned and placed a hand on my lower back, putting on a perfect display of elderly fatigue. I think I need to fetch my reading glasses from the hallway. Connor, I muttered, keeping my voice soft and raspy. Connor practically jumped out of his chair. He looked desperate to move, to do anything to break the suffocating tension in the dining room. "Let me help you, Dad," he said, his voice shaking slightly. I shuffled out of this dining room and into the dimly lit hallway. The sound of Vanessa moving around upstairs was faint, but I knew she would be finishing up her photography session very soon. As we stood near the coat rack, Connor stepped unusually close to me. His back was facing the staircase, ensuring that his body completely blocked my hands from anyone looking down from above. He was sweating. His breathing was shallow and rapid. He did not say a single word. Instead, he reached into the pocket of his trousers and pulled out a small, crumpled piece of paper. His hand was trembling so violently that he almost dropped it. With a frantic, jerky motion, he grabbed my hand and shoved the crumpled receipt deep into my palm. He squeezed my fingers closed over it, his eyes begging me silently to understand the gravity of the situation. I felt the rough texture of the paper against my skin. I did not unfold it. I did not look at it. I simply slid it deep into the front pocket of my flannel shirt, maintaining a blank and pleasant expression on my face. I gave his shoulder a reassuring squeeze. Before Connor could open his mouth to whisper an explanation, the sharp clatter of leather heels echoed from the top of the staircase. The sound cut through the air like a gunshot. We both looked up. Vanessa was standing at the very top of the landing. The warm lighting of the hallway cast long shadows across her face. The designer coat was draped perfectly over her arm, and the document scanner was nowhere to be seen. Her posture was completely rigid, and her eyes were locked onto us with piercing intensity. The sweet, polite facade she had worn during the turkey dinner had vanished entirely. She looked down at my son with an expression of absolute ownership and cold authority. It was the look a warden gives a prisoner who has stepped out of line. "Connor, it is time to go." she stated coldly, her voice echoing down the wooden stairs. Your father needs his rest. Her words were perfectly polite, but the underlying threat was unmistakable. She was not asking him to leave. She was commanding him to abandon me. Connor immediately lowered his head, his shoulders slumping in defeat. I watched my son walk toward the door, leaving me alone in the cabin with a crumpled piece of paper that was about to blow my quiet retirement completely apart. The heavy wooden door clicked shut. I stood motionless in the hallway, listening to the crunch of gravel as Vanessa drove my son away into the freezing November night. The moment the sound of their engine faded down the long, winding driveway, I let my hunched shoulders drop. The fragile, confused old man vanished instantly. I stood up straight, taking a deep breath of the quiet, cold air. I reached into the pocket of my flannel shirt and pulled out the crumpled piece of paper Connor had shoved into my palm. I walked into the kitchen and turned on the overhead light. My hands were perfectly steady. I smoothed the wrinkled receipt against the cold granite countertop. It was just a standard piece of paper from a local coffee shop, but the back was covered in Connor's frantic handwriting. The letters were jagged and rushed, pushed onto the paper with terrifying force. I read the words slowly, absorbing every syllable. She has my signature on a $3 million shell company loan. If I run, I go to federal prison. I stared at the blue ink. $3 million. Federal prison. A cold, calculating silence settled over my mind as the puzzle pieces snapped into place. Connor was not staying with Vanessa out of blind love or naive devotion. He was a hostage. She had framed him, setting him up as the fall guy for a massive financial fraud. If he tried to leave her, or if he tried to warn the authorities, she would pull the trigger and let the federal government lock him away for decades. She had him trapped in a flawless, invisible cage. I folded the receipt and put it in my pocket. I did not panic. Panic is a luxury for the unprepared. I walked past the dining room to the hallway closet. I pushed aside the heavy winter coats and pressed my bare hand against the seemingly solid oak paneling at the back. A concealed biometric scanner read my palm print. The wooden panel unlatched with a soft mechanical click, revealing a dark, narrow stairwell. I descended into the basement. The air down here was cool and dry, smelling faintly of ozone and electricity. At the bottom of the stairs, I unlocked a heavy steel door that looked like it belonged in a bank vault. I stepped inside and flipped the light switch. The room hummed to life. Rows of state-of-the-art servers blinked in the darkness, their cooling fans purring softly. A massive curved monitor illuminated the center of the room. This was my real sanctuary. For 30 years, I tracked ghost money for the government. I hunted phantom corporations and offshore syndicates that thought they were untouchable. I retired to the woods to give my son a quiet life, but I never dismantled my network. I sat down in the leather executive chair and woke up the terminal. My fingers flew across the keyboard, bypassing commercial security protocols and tapping directly into global financial registries. I needed a starting point. I pulled up Connor's public financial records to look for the anomaly. It took me less than 4 minutes to find it. A newly formed limited liability company registered out of Delaware. The company was named Apex Holdings. It was a classic shell structure designed to look like a legitimate software venture capital firm, but functioning entirely as a money laundering vehicle. I dug deeper, slicing through the layers of corporate obfuscation. Vanessa was good. She had buried the ownership details beneath 3 different proxy directors and routed the registration through a blind trust. But she was not dealing with a local bank investigator. She was dealing with the man who wrote the manual on asset tracking. I deployed a specialized tracing algorithm I developed during my final years in the agency. The code began sifting through thousands of wire transfers, looking for the specific digital signature of her offshore accounts. While the algorithm worked, my mind raced. Vanessa was accelerating her timeline. Her aggressive behavior upstairs, pretending to check my medicine cabinet, was a clear indicator that she was preparing to isolate me. She wanted to establish a narrative that I was losing my mind. If she could convince Connor that I was a danger to myself, She could cut me out of his life completely, leaving him with no outside support. But Connor had flipped the mug. He had asked for help. That meant she had not broken him entirely. He was terrified, but he was still fighting. A sharp chime echoed from the computer speakers. The trace was complete. I leaned forward, staring at the data cascading across the screen. What I saw made my jaw clench. Apex Holdings was not just a static shell company waiting for a payout. It was actively operating. Right at this very moment, the company was initiating a series of microtransfers. They were siphoning money out of Connor's personal savings and business accounts, routing the cash through a dozen cryptocurrency tumblers before depositing it into an untraceable account in the Cayman Islands. She was bleeding him dry right in front of my eyes. I watched the numbers drop on the screen. $10,000 here, $20,000 there. She was systematically liquidating his life. She knew Connor was reaching his breaking point. She was cashing out, preparing to vanish, and leave him holding the bag for the $3 million fraudulent loan. I reached for the keyboard, preparing to execute a remote freeze on Connor's accounts. I could lock down his assets using a federal backdoor protocol and stop the bleeding immediately. I wanted to protect my son. But before my fingers could touch the keys, a red priority alert flashed across my secondary monitor. It was an automated notification from the county clerk office. I had set up a monitoring script years ago to track any legal inquiries regarding my own identity and property. I opened the alert and my heart stopped beating for a fraction of a second. Apex Holdings. The exact same shell company draining my son's life had just filed a formal legal document with the county court. I pulled up the digitized file. It was a comprehensive power of attorney declaration. The document claimed that I, Douglas Wright, was suffering from advanced cognitive decline and was no longer capable of managing my own affairs. The authorized signatory, the person granted complete legal control over my life and my medical decisions, was listed as Vanessa Sterling. I stared at the screen, processing the sheer audacity of her move. But that was not the worst part. Attached to the fraudulent power of attorney was a secondary filing. It was a massive commercial lien placed directly against my estate. She was using the fake legal authority to borrow heavily against the value of my property. The true shape of her plan finally became clear. Connor was not her primary target. Connor was just the entry point. She had used him to get close to me. She assumed I was a vulnerable, lonely old man sitting on a piece of prime real estate worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. She was trying to strip my son of his savings, frame him for federal fraud, and use the fabricated medical emergency to steal my home right out from under me. The notification timestamp showed the documents had been filed less than 20 minutes ago, right while she was smiling at my dining room table and telling me I needed to downsize. She was moving with terrifying speed. If that lien was approved, the bank would transfer the funds to her shell company by tomorrow morning. She was going to take everything and leave my son to take the fall. I sat back in my chair, letting the soft blue light of the monitors reflect off my face. Vanessa thought she had trapped a naive software developer and his helpless, senile father. She thought she was running a flawless game. She had no idea she had just walked into a minefield. I cracked my knuckles and reached for the secure, encrypted phone resting on my desk. The time for pretending was over. I stared at the encrypted smartphone resting on my mahogany desk. The screen cast a pale blue glow across the dark basement vault, illuminating the heavy steel door I had locked behind me. Calling local law enforcement was completely out of the question. Local authorities would freeze the accounts with a loud public injunction. Vanessa would see the red flags, immediately trigger her fail-safes, and send my son to federal prison before the sun even came up. I needed surgical precision. I needed a ghost. I dialed a secure, heavy line that I had not used in over 5 years. The phone rang only twice before a sharp, awake voice answered on the other end. "Douglas, it has been a long time." It was Gabriel Foster. Years ago, Gabriel was an ambitious rookie analyst I took under my wing. Today he was a high-powered federal attorney operating at the absolute peak of the Department of Justice. He owed me his career, and he knew it. "Gabriel," I said, my voice low and steady in the quiet room. "I need a shadow quarantine on a commercial lien and a complete blackout on a shell company operating out of Delaware." Gabriel did not ask if I was sure. He did not ask why I was coming out of retirement at midnight on Thanksgiving. He only asked for the target. I gave him the details for the shell company. I explained the fraudulent power of attorney and the pending transaction against my estate. I heard the rapid clacking of a mechanical keyboard through the encrypted line. "Give me 60 seconds, Douglas," he muttered. "I am going through the federal backdoor channels. We cannot freeze it completely, or it will trigger a notification on her end. I am placing a bureaucratic quarantine on the routing numbers. To her syndicate, it will just look like a holiday weekend processing delay. The transaction will spin in a continuous loop, but the money will never actually move." The relief was immediate, but brief. The financial hemorrhage was stopped, but Connor was still trapped in her web. With the money safely locked down, I turned my attention to the woman who was trying to destroy my family. I pulled up Connor public social media profiles on my secondary monitor. I found a high-resolution picture of the two of them from a recent vacation. I cropped Vanessa's face and ran the image through an advanced facial recognition algorithm I maintained on my private servers. The program bypassed standard search engines, diving deep into restricted databases, international watch lists, and flagged financial registries. The progress bar crept forward agonizingly slow. For 10 minutes, the screen showed no matches. She had scrubbed her digital footprint flawlessly. But nobody can erase everything. The algorithm finally caught a fragmented hit from a defunct European casino registry and pulled the thread. The monitor flooded with redacted files and security alerts. Vanessa Sterling did not exist. The woman who had just eaten turkey at my dining room table was a total fabrication. I scrolled through the data, my chest tightening with a mix of awe and absolute disgust. She was a professional extortionist, a ghost operating at the highest levels of white-collar crime. The system matched her face to 3 different aliases across 4 states. Her method of operation was brutally consistent. She targeted the emotionally vulnerable children of high-net-worth families. She would isolate them from their support networks, frame them for massive corporate frauds using forged signatures, and then extort the wealthy parents to cover the fabricated debts. Once she secured the payout, she vanished completely, leaving the ruined child to take the fall. She was not a greedy girlfriend. She was an apex predator, and she had chosen my son as her next meal ticket. I relayed the information to Gabriel. The silence on the other end of the line was heavy. "Douglas," he said, his voice thick with concern. "This is a highly organized syndicate. If she realizes her payout is blocked, she will not hesitate to burn Connor to the ground to protect herself." "I know Gabriel," I replied, eyes fixed on the mugshots of her previous aliases scrolling across my screen. "That is why we are going to make her believe she is winning." I told Gabriel to prepare a watertight federal indictment, but to hold it until I gave the signal. I hung up the phone and leaned back in my leather chair. The basement was quiet again. I had secured the perimeter, but the war was just beginning. A sudden flash of light caught my attention. It was not coming from the monitors. It was coming from the live security feed of my front driveway. My cabin sits at the end of a long, winding dirt road surrounded by dense woods. Nobody comes out here by accident, especially not in the middle of the night. I maximized the camera feed. A heavy black SUV had just pulled to a stop at the edge of my property. The headlights cut aggressively through the bare autumn trees, casting long, sharp shadows across the frost-covered lawn. The engine idled quietly in the freezing November air. The windows were heavily tinted, hiding the occupants inside. My pulse quickened, but I remained perfectly still. They were probing the defenses, seeing if the old man was asleep. Then my cell phone illuminated the dark desk. The caller ID displayed Vanessa's name. She was sitting right outside my house in the dead of night. I picked up the phone, taking a deep breath to summon the frail, frightened old man she expected to hear. I pressed the answer button. "Hello," I asked, my voice trembling perfectly, conveying the confusion of a senior citizen woken from his sleep. "Doug," she said. The musical, polite tone she had used all evening was entirely gone. Her voice was cold, metallic, and utterly devoid of humanity. It was the voice of an executioner. "Listen to me very carefully, old man. I know you are confused, but you need to understand reality. Your son is in very deep trouble. He committed a massive financial fraud. If I make one phone call, he goes to federal prison for the rest of his life." I let out a sharp gasp, gripping the edge of my desk. "What are you talking about?" I pleaded, forcing a desperate sob into my throat. "Connor is a good boy. He would never do anything illegal. Please do not hurt my son." "Cut the pathetic crying," she snapped, cutting me off with brutal efficiency. "I am the only one keeping him out of handcuffs right now. But keeping this quiet is expensive. You have a very valuable piece of property, Doug. Tomorrow morning you are coming to my family lawyer to sign the deed of this house over to me. If you hesitate, if you try to call the police, or if you breathe a word of this to Connor, I will press send on a file that will destroy your boy forever. Have a good night, Doug." The line went dead. I lowered the phone from my ear, staring at the black SUV idling on the camera feed. She thought she had me cornered. She thought I was a terrified father ready to sacrifice everything to save his child. A slow, cold smile crept across my face as the SUV backed out of my driveway and disappeared into the night. She had no idea she just threatened a man who dismantled syndicates for breakfast. I stared at the dead screen of my phone for exactly 3 seconds before dialing her number right back. If I wanted her to believe she had completely broken me, I had to sell the performance of a lifetime. The line rang once before she answered. I did not give her a chance to speak. I launched into a perfectly executed symphony of panic. My breath came in short, ragged gasps. I forced my voice to crack and tremble, begging her to please explain what was happening to my boy. I stuttered, apologizing repeatedly and pleading with her not to let Connor go to prison. I told her I was just a retired old man who did not understand business or loans. I cried real tears, squeezing my eyes shut to make my voice sound thick and pathetic. I told her I would give her the cabin, the land, my savings, anything she wanted as long as she spared my son. Vanessa soaked up every second of my manufactured desperation. Her tone became soothing again, but it was the sickening comfort of a spider wrapping its prey. She told me to meet her at her family attorney office first thing on Black Friday morning to sign the property transfer. She promised that once the deed was in her name, the entire problem would vanish and Connor would be safe. I agreed profusely, thanking her over and over again until she hung up the phone. The moment the call ended, I wiped my face and took a slow, deep breath. The performance was exhausting, but it bought us the exact window of time we needed. I picked up the encrypted line and called Gabriel back. I told him we had 48 hours until the meeting on Black Friday. I instructed him to use that time to build an airtight federal indictment, wrapping up every single shell company, alias, and offshore account connected to her syndicate. We needed a cage so strong that not a single member of her network could slip through the bars. For the next 2 days, I barely slept. I stayed in my basement command center monitoring the quarantine Gabriel had placed on Connor financial accounts. The syndicate kept running automated attempts to pull the funds, blindly bumping against the invisible federal wall we had erected. To them, it looked like a standard holiday banking delay. To me, it looked like a ticking time bomb. The silence in the cabin was heavy and oppressive, but I used the quiet to map out every possible variable. I went over the blueprints of the trap we were setting, ensuring there were no loose ends. I ran background checks on every single name associated with Vanessa and her phantom corporations. I memorized faces, associates, and known locations. By the time Thanksgiving Thursday bled into Black Friday morning, I was ready. I dressed the part of a defeated man. I put on an oversized faded cardigan that made my shoulders look frail and stooped. I chose a pair of worn-out corduroy trousers and scuffed loafers. I did not comb my hair perfectly, leaving it slightly disheveled. I practiced a vacant, terrified look in the mirror. I needed to look like a man who had lost his entire world, a man who was surrendering his dignity to save his only child. The law office was located in a sleek, modern building in the center of the city. It was a cold, intimidating environment designed to make vulnerable people feel small and powerless. Glass walls, chrome fixtures, and pristine white marble floors reflected the icy nature of the people running the operation. I shuffled off the elevator, taking slow, deliberate steps. I leaned heavily on a walking cane I had bought specifically for this occasion. The receptionist did not even look up from her monitor when I approached the desk. She simply pointed down a long, sterile hallway toward a frosted glass door at the very end. As I pushed the heavy door open, the air inside the conference room felt thick and suffocating. Vanessa was sitting at the head of a massive mahogany table. She looked immaculate, wearing a sharp charcoal business suit and a pearl necklace. She smiled warmly when I entered, but the smile was entirely predatory. Sitting adjacent to her was a man in an expensive tailored suit, presenting himself as the family attorney. He had slicked back hair and a condescending gaze. He looked like the kind of man who made a living foreclosing on orphanages. But my eyes immediately bypassed them both and landed on the far corner of the room. Connor was sitting in a low leather chair near the window. My heart physically ached when I saw him. He looked completely destroyed. His eyes were bloodshot, his skin was ashen, and he was staring at the floor with absolute hopelessness. He looked like a man who had accepted a life sentence. He did not look up when I walked in. He was ready to take the fall to go to federal prison just to protect his old father from being thrown out on the street. He truly believed he had ruined our lives, and he was carrying the entire weight of that fabricated guilt on his shoulders. I wanted to walk over and hold him to tell him that everything was under control, that he was safe. I wanted to tell him that the woman sitting across the table was about to face the wrath of a phantom auditor who had dismantled cartels. But I had to maintain the charade. I shuffled toward the empty chair at the table, allowing my hands to shake visibly as I pulled it out. The attorney cleared his throat with a practiced air of authority. He pushed a thick stack of legal documents across the polished wood. It was the deed transfer surrendering my home and my entire estate directly to Vanessa Shell Company. The paperwork was dense, filled with confusing legal jargon designed to overwhelm a layman. A third person stepped out from the shadows near the door to act as the official witness. It was the notary public holding a heavy stamp and a clipboard. I glanced at the notary, and an electric jolt of recognition fired through my brain. I knew that face. I had seen his mugshot just 2 nights ago on my secure monitors. He was not a state official. He was a known associate of the extortion ring wanted in 3 states for wire fraud and identity theft. The syndicate had brought their own inside man to guarantee the paperwork looked legitimate to the county clerk. The fake attorney tapped the thick stack of papers with his index finger. He spoke slowly and loudly, as if addressing a toddler. He told me to sign on the dotted lines to finalize the transition of my assets. He extended his hand and held out a heavy silver pen directly toward me, expecting me to sign my life away. I stared at the heavy silver pen extended toward me by the slick attorney. The polished metal caught the harsh fluorescent lighting of the conference room, reflecting a cold, blinding glare. The attorney gave the pen a slight, impatient shake, expecting me to take it and blindly sign away my entire life. I kept my hands resting on my knees, letting them tremble just enough to look incredibly pathetic. I cleared my throat, producing a weak and raspy sound that echoed awkwardly in the stifling silence of the room. I could smell the cheap, overpowering cologne the attorney wore, a scent that poorly masked the stale smell of cigarette smoke clinging to his suit. "No, thank you," I mumbled, keeping my eyes downcast toward the polished mahogany table. I brought my own. Vanessa let out a sharp, exasperated sigh. The sound was meticulously designed to make me feel small and bothersome, like a disobedient child interrupting adult matters. "Oh, for heaven's sake, Doug just used the pen." She snapped her facade of patience, wearing incredibly thin. We have a very busy schedule today, and we need to get this filed with the county before the holiday weekend begins. I reached a shaky hand into the front pocket of my faded cardigan. I pulled out a simple, cheap-looking black ballpoint pen. It was scratched along the barrel and looked like something you might find abandoned on the floor of a post office. "I am sorry," I whispered, clutching the cheap plastic tightly to my chest. "It is just a silly superstition of an old man. My late wife gave me this pen. I use it for every important document. Please just let me use my own pen." The fake attorney rolled his eyes heavily and looked at Vanessa, seeking permission to indulge my foolishness. She gave a curt, dismissive nod, waving her manicured hand in the air. "If it makes the old fool move faster, let him use the garbage pen," she muttered under her breath, making absolutely sure Connor could hear her cruelty. But Connor did not react to her insult. He remained slumped in his low-leather chair, staring vacantly at the floorboards, completely consumed by the false guilt she had masterfully planted in his mind. I uncapped the pen and pulled the thick stack of legal documents closer to me. The paper was heavy and expensive, carrying the distinct scent of fresh toner. The deed transfer, the power of attorney, the complete relinquishment of my estate. It was all laid out there, bound together with a menacing finality. To Vanessa and her syndicate, my cheap black pen was just a pathetic symbol of an old man clinging hopelessly to the past. They had absolutely no idea that the pen was a specialized piece of equipment I had utilized frequently during my decades working as a forensic auditor. The cartridge inside the scratched plastic casing was not filled with standard ballpoint ink. It was loaded with a highly advanced thermal disappearing compound used strictly in covert federal operations. The blue ink flowed smoothly over the paper and looked perfectly normal to the naked eye. But the chemical composition was incredibly unstable. Within exactly 12 hours of exposure to normal room temperature, the chemical bonds holding the pigment together would completely evaporate. By tomorrow morning, that thick stack of binding legal documents would be nothing more than blank, useless parchment sitting in a county clerk tray. But to make the trap absolutely airtight, I needed to add one more layer of security. A blank document could potentially be contested in court, but a forged or invalid signature added an entirely new dimension of fraud to their impending federal indictment. I placed the tip of the pen on the first designated signature line. I let out a soft, pathetic whimper, making my chest heave. I looked across the wide room at my son. "Connor, please," I whispered, forcing a desperate tear to form in the corner of my eye and trace its way slowly down my wrinkled cheek. "Please tell me this is going to be okay. Tell me we are doing the right thing." Connor squeezed his eyes tightly shut, unable to bear the sight of my manufactured pain. A single tear escaped his lashes and fell onto the dark fabric of his trousers. "I am so sorry, Dad." He choked out, his voice barely a whisper in the quiet room. "I am so sorry I ruined everything. Just sign it. I will make it up to you, I promise." His genuine emotional agony twisted my heart, but I swallowed my protective anger and focused intensely on the task at hand. I looked down at the dotted signature line. My full legal name was printed meticulously beneath the blank space. Douglas Allen Wright. I pressed the pen firmly to the paper and began to write. I let my hand shake violently, making the cursive letters look jagged and uneven, as if drawn by a man terrified of his own actions. And as I formed the letters of my middle name, I deliberately misspelled it. I wrote Allen with 2 L's instead of 1. It was a highly subtle but intentional error. In corporate property law, a signature that does not legally match the printed name on a deed of transfer immediately flags the document as contested in a county clerk system. Even if the thermal ink magically failed to vanish, the misspelled middle name guaranteed the commercial lien would be rejected during processing, locking them out of my equity entirely. I turned to the next page and repeated the deliberate process. Douglas Allen Wright. Page after page, I signed away my home, my land, and my savings. With every careful stroke of the pen, I poured all my manufactured grief into the performance. I let a few tears fall directly onto the expensive parchment, creating small, damp blisters on the paper to sell my utter devastation. The notary, the wanted criminal acting as an official witness, leaned over and stamped each page with a loud, definitive thud, sealing the fake transaction. When I finally reached the final page, my hand was cramping from the deliberate tension I held in my fingers. I signed the final misspelled name and let the pen drop from my grasp. It clattered loudly against the mahogany table. I covered my face with both hands and let out a broken, ragged sob. I let my shoulders heave, projecting the image of a man who had just surrendered his last shred of dignity to save his son. Vanessa did not waste a single second. She lunged forward and snatched the thick folder right out from under my trembling hands. She clutched the documents to her chest as if she had just won the lottery. All traces of the sweet, polite daughter-in-law melted away instantly. Her eyes were alight with pure, predatory triumph. She looked down at me with an expression of absolute, undisguised disgust. "Good boy," she sneered, her voice dripping with poisonous venom. "Now go home and sit quietly in your cabin before you do something else to embarrass yourself." She did not say thank you. She did not offer a single word of comfort to Connor. She simply turned on her heel and marched toward the frosted glass door. The fake attorney and the criminal notary trailed closely behind her, like obedient dogs, leaving us completely alone in the sterile conference room. Connor finally stood up from his chair. He walked over to me slowly, his legs looking heavy and weak. He wrapped his arms tightly around my shoulders and buried his face in my neck, crying silently into my cardigan. "It is going to be okay, Dad," he whispered, his entire body shaking with fear and relief. "I am going to figure this out. I am going to protect you now." I hugged him back, resting my chin on his shoulder. My tears stopped immediately. My face returned to a mask of cold, hard calculation. I reached into my pocket and felt the small receiver connecting to the audio bug I had discreetly slipped into the lining of Vanessa's cashmere coat when she had hung it on the rack in my hallway on Thanksgiving Day. I patted Connor on the back, offering him gentle, empty words of comfort, while I mentally counted the seconds it would take Vanessa to reach the underground parking garage. I slipped the tiny wireless earpiece into my right ear, hiding it completely beneath the collar of my cardigan. I tapped the activation button on my phone inside my pocket, holding my breath as the signal connected. The audio feed crackled to life with crisp digital clarity. I could hear the sharp clicking of her heels against the concrete floor of the parking garage, followed by the electronic chirp of a car unlocking. I heard the heavy door of her luxury sedan open and slam shut, cutting off the ambient noise of the city. Then I heard the sound of her phone dialing. It rang twice before a deep, gruff voice answered on the other end of the line. "Is it done?" the voice asked, lacking any form of greeting. Vanessa let out a loud, arrogant laugh that echoed painfully through my earpiece. "It is perfectly done," she boasted, her voice bouncing in the quiet cabin of her car. The old man broke completely. He sat there and cried like a baby while he signed over the entire estate. "I have the notarized deed right here in my hands." "Excellent," the gruff voice replied. "What about the boy? Do we string him along until the property clears the bank?" I held my breath, pressing the earpiece deeper into my ear. I looked at Connor, who was still wiping his eyes, completely unaware of the execution order being issued against him at this very moment. "No," Vanessa stated, her tone turning brutally cold. "The property is secured, and the boy is a liability now. Liquidate his remaining accounts at midnight tonight. Take every last cent he has left to his name." And then the voice asked, "And then you cut him loose," Vanessa ordered. "Forward the fake embezzlement evidence to the federal authorities anonymously first thing in the morning. Let the feds pick him up and lock him away. Our job here is finished." The drive back from the law office was suffocatingly quiet. Connor kept his eyes fixed on the passenger side window, watching the gray city blocks blur past. He was vibrating with a silent, toxic mixture of shame and terror, completely consumed by the belief that his financial negligence was about to cost me my home and my freedom. I pulled my old sedan up to the curb outside his apartment building, keeping my hands wrapped tightly around the steering wheel to maintain the illusion of a terrified, trembling father. I told him I needed to go lie down and rest my heart. He nodded weakly, apologizing one last time before stepping out into the freezing wind. I waited exactly until the heavy glass door of his lobby swung shut behind him. Then my hunched shoulders squared. My grip on the steering wheel turned to iron. I shifted the car into gear and drove in the opposite direction, leaving the fragile old man persona sitting on the curb. I had less than 10 hours before midnight. Less than 10 hours before Vanessa and her syndicate executed the kill switch on my son, liquidating his remaining accounts and framing him for a $3 million federal fraud. I bypassed the main highways and took a series of back roads until I reached an old forgotten diner on the edge of the county line. The parking lot was empty save for a rusted pickup truck. I took a booth in the far back corner facing the door and pulled my encrypted laptop from my canvas bag. I booted the system and immediately opened a secure line to Gabriel Foster. I did not waste time with pleasantries. I relayed the audio intercept I had captured in the parking garage detailing the midnight liquidation order. Gabriel remained dead silent on the other end of the line, absorbing the magnitude of the escalation. "They are moving to burn him," Gabriel finally said, his voice tight with professional urgency. "If that money leaves his accounts tonight, the paper trail will cement his guilt in the eyes of the Securities and Exchange Commission. We cannot let that wire transfer hit the open banking network." I told Gabriel I wanted a federal shadow account. It was an aggressive countermeasure we used to use against offshore money launderers. Gabriel hesitated for a fraction of a second, reminding me that setting up a shadow routing protocol without a signed judicial warrant was highly irregular. I reminded him that the woman organizing this theft was currently carrying a deed to my home secured with disappearing thermal ink and a forged notary stamp. Gabriel dropped his objections immediately. He began typing furiously on his end, patching into the Department of Justice Cyber Division. We worked together for 3 solid hours, building a digital blockade around Connor financial identity. We coded a trapdoor into his routing numbers. When the syndicate initiated the midnight sweep, the money would appear to leave his accounts normally, but instead of crossing into international waters, it would be instantly swallowed by a secure, heavily encrypted federal holding vault. With the digital snare armed and waiting, I needed to pull my son out of the psychological hell he was living in. I pulled out a clean burner phone and typed a message to a hidden encrypted messenger application I had secretly installed on Connor's personal laptop months ago, just in case of an emergency like this. I instructed him to leave his cell phone, his smartwatch, and any internet-connected device in his apartment. I told him to take a cash taxi to the diner and to make sure he was not followed. Connor walked through the diner doors 40 minutes later. He looked like a man walking to the gallows. He was shivering without a winter coat, his eyes darting around the empty restaurant in pure panic. He slid into the vinyl booth across from me, refusing to meet my gaze. "Dad," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Why did you make me come here? Vanessa is going to be furious if she finds out I left the apartment. She said we cannot make any sudden moves until the house deed clears the county records." I reached across the sticky Formica table and closed my laptop screen halfway. I looked my son directly in the eyes. I dropped the raspy, fragile tone I had used all day. My voice was deep, steady, and commanded absolute authority. "Vanessa is not going to clear anything I said clearly and firmly. And you are not going to federal prison." Connor blinked, staring at me in total confusion. He opened his mouth to ask if my mind was slipping, but I spun the laptop around and pushed it across the table toward him. I opened the main directory. I did not show him financial spreadsheets or complicated bank codes. I showed him a gallery of police mugshots. I showed him 3 different women, all possessing the same piercing eyes, the same perfect smile, and the same predatory bone structure. I watched my son read the different aliases attached to each photograph. "Her real name is not Vanessa Sterling," I explained, keeping my tone clinical and precise so he would not drown in panic. "She is a professional extortionist. She targets successful men, isolates them from their families, and uses their credentials to take out massive fraudulent corporate loans. The $3 million shell company debt hanging over your head is not real, Connor. It is a highly sophisticated forgery. You did not mismanage your software firm. You did not accidentally commit wire fraud. You were targeted, you were groomed, and you were perfectly framed. Connor stared at the screen as if it were a venomous snake. His chest began to heave as his brain desperately tried to reconcile the loving woman he wanted to marry with the cold, calculating criminal staring back at him from the federal watch lists. He scrolled through the files, his hands shaking violently as he read the police reports from the previous victims. Men who had been financially ruined, men who had taken their own lives because of the unbearable shame of the debts she had manufactured. But the loan, he stammered, clutching the edge of the table. I saw my signature on the documents. I authorized the server access. She told me I made a mistake holding the data for the overseas clients. She manipulated your network logs, I corrected him. She used your emotional attachment to blind your professional judgment. She convinced you that you were a criminal so you would be too terrified to go to the authorities. She manufactured a crisis so massive that you would gladly let her steal my entire estate just to keep you out of a jail cell. The realization hit him with the force of a freight train. The crushing, suffocating guilt he had been carrying for weeks suddenly vanished, leaving behind a massive gaping crater of absolute betrayal. His shoulders began to shake. He buried his face in his hands and broke down completely right there in the diner booth. He wept for the illusion of his relationship, for the betrayal of his trust, and for the sheer terror he had endured. I did not tell him to stop crying. I let him purge the poison from his system. I simply reached across the table and gripped his shoulder, letting him know that the isolation was over. When his breathing finally slowed, I handed him a napkin. We have less than an hour until midnight, I told him. At 12 o'clock exactly, her syndicate is going to attempt to liquidate every remaining dollar in your name and leave you with nothing. We are going to sit here and watch them fail. Connor wiped his face, staring at the digital clock on the bottom corner of the computer monitor. The diner was dead quiet. The minutes ticked by with agonizing slowness. At 1 minute to midnight, Gabriel sent a secure ping confirming the shadow account was active and waiting. I opened the live transaction terminal on the screen. 10 seconds. 5 seconds. At exactly midnight, the screen flashed red. An automated script originating from an untraceable server in Eastern Europe executed a sweeping withdrawal command against Connor banking profile. I watched my son hold his breath as the digital numbers began to drain. But instead of routing through the usual offshore tumblers, the data stream slammed violently into Gabriel's invisible federal wall. The numbers scrambled, flashed green, and settled safely into the Department of Justice holding vault. The transaction was intercepted. The money was completely secured. Connor let out a massive, shuddering exhale, slumping back against the vinyl booth. We caught them. He whispered, a frantic, hopeful smile breaking across his face, but my eyes remained locked on the monitor. A highly organized syndicate does not just accept a failed transfer. They monitor their networks with aggressive security protocols. Within 40 seconds, the terminal registered an external ping. The syndicate automated system had recognized that the routing protocol belonged to a federal enforcement agency. They knew the money had not bounced due to a bank error. They knew they had stepped into a trap. Right beside my laptop, my untraceable burner phone suddenly vibrated against the table. The screen lit up with an incoming text message from an unknown encrypted number. The timing was too perfect to be a coincidence. I reached out and picked up the phone. I opened the message, reading the single line of text shining brightly in the dim light of the diner. You think you are smart, old man. We are coming to the house. I stared at the glowing screen of the burner phone, reading the threat over and over. We are coming to the house. The syndicate thought they were initiating a reign of terror. They thought they were sending a message to a frightened civilian who had gotten lucky with a bank transfer. I slowly slid the phone into my pocket and looked across the diner table at Connor. He was pale, his eyes wide with renewed panic. He started to stammer, asking if we needed to call the police, if we needed to run and hide. I held up my hand, asking for absolute silence. I told him to stay exactly where he was. I ordered him not to leave the diner, not to answer any calls, and to order another cup of coffee. I told him his father had some yard work to take care of. I walked out into the freezing November night, leaving my son safely behind the warm glass windows of the diner. The drive back to my property took exactly 14 minutes. I did not speed. I did not rush. I drove with the calm, steady precision of a man heading into a familiar workspace. The rural roads were completely empty, swallowed by the pitch-black darkness of the upstate woods. When I turned onto my long dirt driveway, the heavy iron gates stood closed and silent. I keyed the remote and drove my old sedan through, parking it out of sight behind the detached woodshed. The cabin was deadly quiet when I stepped inside. The air was cold and still. I walked straight to the hall closet and pressed my palm against the hidden biometric scanner. I descended into the basement vault, the hum of the servers greeting me like old friends. I did not sit at the computer terminal this time. I walked to a tall steel locker bolted to the far wall. I spun the combination dial and pulled open the heavy door. Inside, resting on a velvet rack, was a 12-gauge pump-action shotgun. I had not fired it in 10 years, but I kept it meticulously cleaned and oiled. I racked the slide, making sure the chamber was clear. I was not planning to shoot anyone tonight. I was planning to orchestrate a psychological dismantling. An unloaded weapon is just a piece of metal, but in the dark, illuminated by the right lighting, it is a universal language of absolute authority. I carried the shotgun upstairs and laid it gently on the kitchen counter. I pulled out my secure phone and dialed Gabriel. He answered immediately. I told him we had incoming hostiles. I gave him the coordinates of my driveway and told him to stand by. I needed him to access the federal biometric database and link it directly to the facial recognition cameras mounted on my front porch. Gabriel understood the assignment instantly. He told me he was tapping into the National Crime Information Center and would be ready to speak the moment they stepped out of their vehicle. I put the phone on speaker, maximizing the volume, and set it down next to the shotgun. I turned off every single light inside the cabin. The house plunged into total darkness. I stood by the front window, looking out through the wooden blinds. The freezing wind rustled the bare branches of the oak trees, casting long, skeletal shadows across the frost-covered lawn. I waited. In my 30 years of hunting criminals, I learned that the waiting is what breaks amateur operatives. But I was not an amateur. I controlled my breathing, slowing my heart rate down to a steady, calm rhythm. 20 minutes later, the silence of the woods was broken by the low, heavy growl of a powerful engine. Through the trees, I saw the sweep of headlights cutting through the darkness. The black SUV had returned. It crawled to a stop in front of my heavy iron gates. I watched on my tablet screen as two large men stepped out of the vehicle. They were dressed in dark tactical clothing, moving with the arrogant swagger of street-level enforcers. They thought they were dealing with a terrified old man. They grabbed a heavy steel crowbar from the trunk and jammed it into the electronic locking mechanism of my gate. With a loud metallic snap, they forced the gate open, pushing it wide enough for the SUV to pass through. They climbed back into the vehicle and drove slowly down my winding driveway. The gravel crunched loudly beneath their heavy tires. They were taking their time, deliberately trying to build an atmosphere of intimidation. They parked roughly 30 feet from my front porch, leaving the engine running and the headlights shining directly at my front door. The two men stepped out, leaving their doors open. They cracked their knuckles, stretching their massive shoulders, trying to look as menacing as possible. One of them pulled a metal pipe from his jacket, tapping it rhythmically against his open palm. They took 3 steps toward my porch. That was exactly when I sprang the trap. I pressed a single red button on my tablet screen. At the end of the driveway, the heavy iron gates slammed shut with a violent echoing crash. The sound made both men jump. The heavy steel locking bolts engaged, automatically sealing the perimeter. The enforcers spun around, staring at the closed gates in sudden confusion. Their escape route was entirely cut off. Their vehicle was trapped inside a fortified compound. Before they could process what had just happened, I triggered the secondary defense protocol. 12 high-lumen tactical floodlights mounted under the eaves of my roof ignited simultaneously. The blast of pure white light was blinding. It hit the two men with physical force, washing out the darkness and exposing them entirely. They threw their arms up over their faces, swearing loudly and stumbling backward toward their vehicle. The sudden transition from pitch black to stadium-level illumination disoriented them completely, stripping away their arrogant swagger in a fraction of a second. I opened the front door and stepped out onto the porch. The freezing wind hit my face, but I did not flinch. I held the pump-action shotgun casually across my chest, resting the barrel in the crook of my arm. I did not aim it at them. I did not need to. My posture communicated absolute dominant control. I looked down at the two blinded, disoriented men stumbling on my lawn. I reached into my pocket, pulled out the burner phone, and tossed it underhand. It landed with a soft clatter on the gravel exactly halfway between my boots and their vehicle. The man with the metal pipe lowered his arm, squinting against the blinding light. He looked from the shotgun in my hands down to the glowing phone on the ground. "Pick it up," I commanded, my voice echoing loudly in the quiet woods. My tone was not angry. It was terrifyingly calm. The man hesitated, his bravado completely evaporated. He slowly bent down, keeping his eyes fixed on the barrel of my shotgun, and picked up the phone. He held it up to his ear, his hand shaking visibly. Through the dead silence of the property, Gabriel's voice boomed from the phone speaker. The federal attorney did not say hello. He simply began reading. Marcus Vance, also known as Marcus the Jaw, wanted in Nevada for 2 counts of armed extortion and 1 count of aggravated assault. Your current primary residence is an apartment on West Elm Street where your girlfriend is currently sleeping. And your associate standing next to you is David Chen, wanted in federal court for wire fraud and interstate racketeering. Your mother lives in a nursing home in New Jersey, paid for by stolen funds. The color drained instantly from both men's faces. They stared at the phone as if it were a live grenade. They had come to intimidate a senile old man. Instead, they had walked blindly into a meticulously designed federal honey trap. Gabriel continued, speaking, his voice cold and unrelenting. You are currently standing on private property owned by a highly protected federal asset. You are surrounded by high-definition biometric cameras recording your presence for a federal grand jury. If you are not off this property in exactly 30 seconds, I am dispatching a tactical strike team to your exact coordinates and to the coordinates of your respective families. The man holding the phone dropped it as if it burned his fingers. The device hit the gravel and shattered. He did not look at me. He did not look at his partner. He simply turned and ran. He sprinted past the idling SUV, ignoring the open doors, and ran blindly toward the tree line. His partner dropped the metal pipe and followed immediately, scrambling over the frost-covered ground in absolute panic. They did not care about their vehicle. They did not care about their syndicate. They only cared about escaping the nightmare they had just stumbled into. I stood on the porch watching them scramble over the stone wall at the edge of the woods, tearing their dark clothing on the thorny brush as they vanished into the freezing night. The driveway was completely silent again, save for the low hum of their abandoned engine. I lowered the shotgun, resting the stock against the wooden planks of my porch. I breathed in the crisp, cold air, feeling a profound sense of satisfaction settling in my chest. Vanessa had sent her muscle, expecting them to bring me to my knees. Instead, she had just lost her entire physical enforcement team. The men she relied on to intimidate her victims were currently running for their lives through the freezing wilderness, absolutely terrified of their own shadows. She had no protection left. She had no backup. She was completely isolated, believing she still controlled the narrative. She had no idea she was now standing entirely alone on a stage I had built just for her. The faded corduroy trousers and the oversized wool cardigan felt heavy as I pulled them off and dropped them onto my bedroom floor. For weeks, I had worn those clothes like a suffocating disguise, carefully constructing the image of a frail, terrified old man who was slowly losing his grip on reality. I walked over to the back of my closet and pushed aside the rows of flannel shirts. Reaching into the dark recess, I pulled out a heavy garment bag. I unzipped the canvas and carefully extracted a tailored charcoal gray suit. It was a bespoke garment cut with absolute precision, designed for boardrooms and federal tribunals. I put on a crisp white shirt, buttoned it to the collar, and fastened a dark silk tie. As I slipped the suit jacket over my shoulders, I looked at myself in the tall mirror. The fragile, shuffling retiree was completely gone. Staring back at me was the man who had spent 3 decades dismantling the most dangerous financial predators on the globe. I adjusted my cuffs, feeling the familiar weight of authority settle into my bones. The time for hiding was officially over. I drove to the city, taking my time as I navigated toward the upscale restaurant Vanessa had chosen for her engagement dinner. The venue was exactly what I expected from a professional grifter obsessed with the illusion of wealth. It was an exclusive, high-end establishment known for crystal chandeliers, white glove service, and exorbitant prices that kept the general public away. She had booked their private dining room, wanting to isolate Connor from the main crowd while she paraded him in front of her syndicate associates and a few carefully selected guests who believed her lies. She was funding this lavish display with the credit lines she had fraudulently opened, expecting my estate to cover the bill by morning. I parked my sedan a block away and walked toward the restaurant entrance. The cold November wind bit at my face, but I barely felt it. I stepped through the heavy glass doors and immediately caught the attention of the maitre d'. He was a tall, imposing man, trained to keep unwanted elements out of the dining area. He opened his mouth to ask for my reservation, but I did not give him the chance to speak. I walked directly up to him with a commanding presence that immediately forced him to take a step back. I reached into the inside pocket of my jacket and pulled out a thick, banded stack of $100 bills, placing it firmly on his podium. "I am not here to dine," I said, my voice low, smooth, and carrying a tone of absolute, undeniable authority. "My son is currently in the private dining room at the back of your establishment. In exactly 5 minutes, there is going to be a significant legal disruption inside that room. I am paying you to walk over to those heavy oak doors and lock them from the outside. You will not open them for anyone under any circumstances until federal agents arrive to secure the premises. Do we understand each other?" The manager looked down at the stack of cash and then up at my eyes. He swallowed hard, recognizing instantly that he was dealing with a situation far above his pay grade. He nodded slowly, discreetly, sweeping the money off the podium and sliding it into his pocket. "Consider the doors sealed, sir," he murmured, keeping his head bowed respectfully. I walked past the main dining area, ignoring the clinking of crystal glasses and the soft murmur of wealthy patrons. The private dining room was located at the end of a long, dimly lit corridor. I did not knock. I simply turned the brass handle and pushed the heavy oak doors open, stepping inside just as the manager quietly moved to secure the locks behind me. The atmosphere inside the room was thick with expensive perfume and the smell of roasted lamb. Champagne bottles sat chilling in silver buckets. Connor was seated near the center of the long table, looking absolutely miserable. His skin was pale and his eyes were hollow, staring down at a plate of untouched food. He looked like a prisoner of war who had completely given up hope. Beside him sat Vanessa, radiating a sickening aura of triumphant joy. She wore a stunning crimson dress that commanded attention, laughing brightly at a joke made by one of her fake relatives seated across the table. The moment I stepped fully into the room, the laughter died instantly. The silence was swift and suffocating as every eye turned toward the doorway. Connor looked up and his breath hitched in his throat. He blinked repeatedly, staring at me in total disbelief. He was expecting the broken, weeping father he had left at the law office the previous day. He was expecting a shuffling victim. Instead, he saw a man standing tall, broad-shouldered, and dressed in a suit that cost more than Vanessa's entire counterfeit wardrobe. Vanessa froze her champagne glass, stopping halfway to her lips. For a fraction of a second, genuine confusion flashed across her perfect features. She looked me up and down, trying to reconcile the sharp, powerful figure standing before her with the crying old fool who had blindly signed away his house with a cheap plastic pen. But her arrogance quickly overrode her instincts. She forced her sweet, condescending smile back onto her face, believing she still held the ultimate trump card. She thought she owned me. "Well, look who decided to join us," she announced, her voice echoing loudly in the quiet room. She stood up from her chair, smoothing her crimson dress and picking up her champagne flute. "I must say, Doug, I am surprised you found your way here all by yourself, given your recent struggles with memory and navigation. But since you are here, you are just in time for the big announcement." She tapped her manicured fingernail against her glass, drawing the attention of everyone at the table. She wanted an audience for her final victory lap. She wanted to humiliate me publicly, to cement her absolute dominance over my son and my legacy, family and friends. She began, her tone dripping with false affection. "We are gathered here tonight to celebrate not just an engagement, but the securing of our future. As many of you know, Connor father has been struggling deeply with his cognitive health. It has been a heartbreaking burden on my sweet fiancée to watch his mind slip away. But family steps up when times get hard." Connor squeezed his eyes shut, his hands gripping the edge of the table so tightly his knuckles turned white. I did not say a word. I simply stood at the head of the room, my hands clasped loosely in front of me, watching her dig her own grave with every single arrogant syllable. That is why I am so incredibly proud to announce that as of yesterday morning, I have officially taken over the management of the Wright family estate, Vanessa declared, beaming with pride. Doug has realized he can no longer care for himself. He has signed the necessary power of attorney and transferred the deed to his property over to my management firm. We have already selected a wonderful assisted living facility for him to move into this weekend, where he can finally get the round-the-clock medical supervision his deteriorating mind desperately requires. A few of her syndicate associates clapped politely, playing along with the charade. Vanessa reached down to the empty chair beside her and picked up a thick, leather-bound portfolio. It was the exact same folder she had aggressively snatched from my hands in the conference room. She held it up like a hunting trophy. "I have the notarized documents right here," she bragged, her eyes locking onto mine with an expression of pure vicious cruelty. "Everything is signed, sealed, and filed. The transition is complete, and Connor and I can finally begin our lives without any heavy, expensive burdens weighing us down." I tilted my head slightly, offering her a small, chillingly calm smile. "You should probably double-check those signatures, Vanessa," I said, my voice slicing clearly through the tense air of the dining room. "I hear cognitive decline can cause a man to make the strangest mistakes on important legal paperwork." Vanessa scoffed, rolling her eyes at my comment. She flipped open the heavy leather cover of the portfolio, preparing to display my tear-stained signature to the table. She looked down at the thick stack of expensive parchment. The triumphant smile on her face instantly vanished. The color completely drained from her cheeks, leaving her looking like a wax mannequin. She frantically flipped to the second page, then the third, tearing through the documents with growing aggressive desperation. Her breathing hitched, catching sharply in her throat. The thermal ink had performed flawlessly. After 12 hours at room temperature, the chemical bonds had completely evaporated, leaving absolutely no trace of pigment behind. Every single signature line was entirely empty. The pages were immaculate, pristine, and completely devoid of any legal authority. The fraudulent deed, the power of attorney, the entire foundation of her master plan had simply vanished into thin air, leaving her holding a folder full of completely blank paper. She looked up slowly, her eyes wide with absolute bottomless horror, as she finally realized she had been outplayed. The silence in the private dining room was so absolute, you could hear the soft hum of the air conditioning. Vanessa stood at the head of the long table holding the empty folder, her face completely drained of color. For 3 long seconds, she simply stared at the blank parchment, unable to comprehend how her flawless master plan had just evaporated into thin air. Then the survival instincts of a cornered predator kicked in. She dropped the folder onto the table and let out a forced, shaky laugh that sounded more like a dry heave. "Oh my goodness," she stammered, her eyes darting wildly around the room, trying to read the faces of her syndicate associates who were sitting frozen in their chairs. "Doug, sweetie, You must have brought the wrong folder from the house. You have been so confused lately getting your documents mixed up. Do not worry about it. We can just print fresh copies tomorrow. She turned to Connor, placing a hand on his shoulder in a desperate attempt to maintain her facade of control. Connor, honey, tell your father to sit down. He is clearly having an episode and making a scene. Connor did not look at her. He did not pull away from her touch, but he kept his eyes locked on me, his face set in a mask of cold, hard clarity. He knew the truth now, and her attempts at manipulation only cemented the depth of her betrayal. I did not sit down. I stepped away from the doorway, walking slowly and deliberately toward the center of the room. I reached into the inside pocket of my tailored suit and pulled out a small black remote control. You did not misplace the documents, Vanessa. I said, my voice steady and completely devoid of the fragile elderly tremor I had used for weeks. You just underestimated the chemical properties of thermal disappearing ink. Vanessa froze, her hand dropping from Connor's shoulder. The fake smile vanished, replaced by a look of dawning terror. She realized she was not dealing with a senile old man who had made a lucky mistake. She was dealing with someone who had intentionally laid a trap. Before she could form a coherent response, I pointed the remote toward the large smart screen mounted on the far wall of the dining room. I pressed a single button. The screen flared to life, instantly projecting a high-definition digital dossier for the entire room to see. The first image was not a financial record. It was a police mugshot from 7 years ago. The woman in the photograph had darker hair and sharper features, but the predatory eyes were unmistakably the same. Let us clear up any confusion right now, I announced, pacing slowly behind the row of seated guests. The woman standing at the head of this table is not Vanessa Sterling. According to the Federal Registry, her birth name is Rachel Lawson. She has operated under the aliases Chloe Vance, Emily Thorne, and Sarah Davenport across 4 different states over the past 10 years. I clicked the remote, advancing to the next slide. A detailed timeline appeared, tracking her movements alongside major white-collar fraud cases. Her entire operation relies on targeting the children of high-net-worth families. She isolates them, fabricates massive corporate debts using forged signatures, and then extorts the wealthy parents to cover the losses before vanishing without a trace. Vanessa took a step back, bumping hard against her chair. Her eyes were wide with panic, looking frantically toward the heavy oak doors at the back of the room. This is a lie, she shrieked, her voice pitching into genuine hysteria. This is a fabricated smear campaign. Connor, he is trying to ruin us. You have to stop him. Connor remained perfectly still, staring at the screen, as the evidence of his near destruction was laid bare in front of him. I clicked the remote again. 2 new mugshots appeared on the screen. They were the faces of the older couple who had been sitting across the table pretending to be Vanessa, loving wealthy parents, and her family support network. I continued, my tone clinical and relentless. They are not retired real estate magnates from California. The man claiming to be her father is a known associate of an interstate extortion ring wanted for wire fraud. The woman playing her mother has 3 prior convictions for identity theft. They are hired actors paid to legitimize her cover story. The 2 syndicate members shoved their chairs back violently, the heavy wood scraping loudly against the floor. They did not try to deny the accusations. The absolute precision of the data displayed on the screen confirmed they had been compromised by a federal-level intelligence sweep. They abandoned Vanessa immediately, moving swiftly toward the double doors at the back of the room, desperate to escape the trap. They grabbed the brass handles and pulled hard. The doors did not move. They threw their combined weight against the heavy wood, shoving and twisting the handles with rising panic. The locks held firm. The restaurant manager had followed my instructions perfectly, sealing the room from the outside. They were completely trapped in a cage of their own making. You cannot hold us here, the fake father shouted, spinning around with a look of cornered aggression. This is unlawful detainment. I will sue you for everything you have. I ignored his empty threat and focused my attention back on Vanessa. She was breathing heavily, her chest heaving as she desperately searched for a way out. She grabbed her designer purse from the table, clutching it to her chest like a shield. I clicked the remote one final time. The screen shifted from mugshots to a live feed of the federal shadow account Gabriel had established. And finally, I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. The $3 million shell company loan you used to terrorize my son. At exactly midnight last night, your automated systems attempted to liquidate Connor's remaining personal accounts to cover the fabricated debt. The money was routed directly into a secured holding vault monitored by the Department of Justice Cyber Division. The transaction is frozen. The offshore accounts connected to your syndicate have been flagged, and the digital trail leads directly back to the IP address of your personal laptop. Vanessa stared at this banking data displayed on the wall, her face completely slack. The realization that her entire financial network had been dismantled, that her leverage was gone, and that she was physically trapped in a locked room finally broke her. She let out a sharp, frustrated scream, dropping her purse onto the table. "This is not over," she hissed, her eyes blazing with pure, unadulterated venom. "You think you can just lock us in a room and project some stolen files? You have no legal authority to hold us here. I am leaving, and if you try to stop me, I will press charges for assault and kidnapping." She took a defiant step forward, but the sound of heavy footsteps stopped her dead in her tracks. The footsteps were not coming from the locked oak doors at the back of the room. They were coming from the swinging service doors that led directly into the restaurant kitchen. The doors pushed open smoothly. A tall, distinguished man in a sharp, tailored suit stepped into the private dining room. It was Gabriel Foster. He did not look like the young, ambitious analyst I had trained decades ago. He looked like the apex predator of the federal legal system. Flanking him on either side were two broad-shouldered federal agents wearing dark suits and carrying heavy tactical radios on their belts. Gabriel held a thick stack of manila folders in his hand. He surveyed the room with cold, calculating eyes, pausing briefly to nod respectfully in my direction before locking his gaze entirely on Vanessa. "I assure you, Miss Lawson," Gabriel said, his voice booming with absolute, terrifying authority. "The authority in this room is completely legally binding. I am Gabriel Foster, lead prosecutor for the Department of Justice White-Collar Crime Division, and I am holding a stack of federal subpoenas and arrest warrants with your actual name printed clearly on every single page." Gabriel Foster stood in the doorway like a monolith. The warm ambient lighting of the private dining room suddenly felt harsh and unforgiving. The two federal agents flanking him did not speak or move. They simply rested their hands near their tactical belts, their presence completely sealing the room. Vanessa stared at the heavy stack of subpoenas in Gabriel's hand. I watched her perfectly manicured fingers twitch. The polished, confident woman, who had just boasted about locking me in a memory care facility, was gone. In her place was a cornered animal calculating the exact distance between herself and the nearest exit. She looked at the agents. She looked at the locked oak doors at the back of the room. She looked at Gabriel. The realization hit her with the crushing weight of a falling building. The long con was dead. Her syndicate associates had abandoned her. Her fake parents were pacing frantically like trapped rats. Her offshore accounts were frozen. The flawless, invisible web she had woven around my son had been entirely dismantled in less than 48 hours. But a professional grifter never simply surrenders. When all avenues of escape are closed, they do not ask for mercy. They reach for a hostage. Vanessa slowly backed away from the head of the table. Her breathing became shallow and rapid. She bumped into a serving cart, sending a silver ice bucket rattling against the wall. She did not look at me or Gabriel. She locked her predatory gaze entirely on Connor. "If you take one more step toward me, I will ruin him," she screamed. Her voice was shrill and raw, completely stripped of its musical charm. The sound echoed violently against the crystal chandeliers. She pointed a trembling finger directly at my son. "Do you think I am stupid? Do you think I operate without a safety net? If I walk out of here in handcuffs, your precious boy goes straight to a maximum security prison." Gabriel did not move a single inch. He simply raised an eyebrow, waiting for her to hang herself with her own words. "I have a dead man. Switch programmed directly into my private server. Vanessa shouted, her chest heaving as she backed further into the corner of the room. It is linked to my phone. If I do not enter a biometric passcode every 12 hours, or if I trigger the panic sequence right now, a massive encrypted data dump goes straight to the Securities and Exchange Commission and the Regional Federal Field Office. It contains every single forged contract, every fake ledger, and every offshore transfer bearing Connor exact digital signature. I will bury him. I will bury him so deep under federal fraud charges that he will never see the sun again. She was panting now, her eyes wide and manic. She reached out and grabbed her heavy designer purse from the table, clutching it tightly against her chest. My phone is right here, she threatened, her voice dropping to a desperate hiss. You let me walk out of that kitchen door right now. You let me get into a car and leave the city. If you try to stop me, I press one button and Connor's life is entirely over. I will drag him straight to hell with me. The room fell into a suffocating, dead silence. The federal agents looked toward Gabriel, waiting for a command. Vanessa stood in the corner, gripping her purse, her knuckles stark white, believing she still held the ultimate weapon of mutually assured destruction. She expected Connor to break. She expected him to fall to his knees and beg me to let her go. She expected the terrified, guilty victim she had spent months grooming to submit to her demands. But Connor did not beg. Connor did not cry. The heavy scrape of wood against the floorboards cut through the silence. Connor pushed his chair back and slowly stood up. He did not hunch his shoulders. He did not cast his eyes downward. He stood tall, pulling himself to his full height. He looked across the room at the woman who had terrorized his waking hours and haunted his sleep. The paralyzing fear that had gripped him since Thanksgiving Day was completely gone. In its place was a quiet, absolute clarity. You are not going to press anything, Connor said. His voice was not loud, but it carried a steady, resonant calm that commanded the entire room. It was the voice of a man who had finally woken up from a terrible nightmare. Vanessa blinked, staring at him in sheer disbelief. You do not understand what is at stake, you idiot, she spat, clutching the purse tighter. I will destroy you. Connor took a slow, deliberate step toward her. He did not look angry. He looked at her with a profound, clinical pity. The dead man switch only works if the authorities do not already have the original source code, Vanessa. Or should I say, Rachel. Her breath hitched in her throat. The sound of her real name coming from the man she thought she owned sent a visible shockwave through her body. Yesterday afternoon, while you thought I was sitting in my apartment, crying in fear, I was sitting in a diner with my father. Connor continued, his voice perfectly even. We did not just freeze your shell company. We packed up every single digital crumb of your operation. We packaged the fake ledgers, the forged signatures, the routing numbers, and the manipulated network logs. We took everything you built to frame me and we handed it directly to the cyber division of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Vanessa shook her head rapidly, her eyes darting back and forth in frantic denial. No, she whispered. No, you do not know how to do that. You are too weak. I am a senior software developer, Connor replied, taking another step forward. You used my emotions to blind me, but you forgot what I actually do for a living. Once my father showed me your true identity and removed the psychological blindfold, it took me less than 3 hours to reverse engineer your entire extortion framework. He paused, letting the absolute finality of his words sink in. I submitted the complete evidence package yesterday, Connor said. I cleared my own name. I provided them with the original decryption keys, proving that my signature was entirely fabricated by an external source. The federal investigators already have the data dump you are threatening me with. But more importantly, they have the exact digital trace leading straight back to your private server. Your internet protocol address is red flagged across every single watch list in the country. Your dead man switch is completely useless. It is just a brick in a purse. Vanessa stared at him. The reality of her situation hit her with brutal, unforgiving force. The hostage she relied on was gone. The leverage she possessed was completely neutralized. She was a professional grifter who had built an empire on lies and manipulation, and she had just been outsmarted by the very man she considered her most pathetic victim. The psychological collapse was instantaneous. The polished, elegant woman completely shattered. She realized that the phone inside her purse was no longer a weapon against Connor. It was the final nail in her own coffin. The device held the cryptographic keys to her entire syndicate. It held the communication logs, the offshore account numbers, and the direct contacts of her criminal superiors. If the federal agents standing in the doorway confiscated that phone, she would not just go to prison for fraud. She would face decades of racketeering charges, and her own syndicate would likely have her killed for exposing their network. She needed to destroy the physical evidence. She needed to smash the device into 100 unrecognizable pieces to save herself from the deepest levels of federal prosecution. With a guttural, animalistic scream, Vanessa ripped the designer purse open. She plunged her hand inside, digging frantically for the smartphone. Her eyes were completely wild, dilated with pure, unadulterated panic. She found the device wrapping her fingers around the metal casing and yanked it free. She raised her arm high above her head, preparing to hurl the phone violently against the solid brick wall of the dining room, intending to shatter the motherboard into irreversible dust. But I was already moving. I did not move like a 65-year-old retiree with bad knees. I moved with the muscle memory of a federal operative who had spent a lifetime anticipating the desperate actions of cornered criminals. Before her arm could begin its downward arc, I closed the distance between us. I stepped directly into her personal space, completely invading her physical perimeter. I reached up and intercepted her descending arm. I grabbed her wrist tightly, twisting it just enough to instantly neutralize her leverage. I did not use excessive violence. I used perfectly calculated mechanical pressure. Vanessa gasped in shock as her arm was completely immobilized in the air. Her fingers involuntarily opened wide, responding to the targeted pressure on her nerve cluster. The smartphone slipped smoothly from her open palm. I caught the device effortlessly in my other hand before it could even begin to fall. I pinned her wrist, firmly holding her completely frozen in place as I secured the phone safely into the inside pocket of my tailored suit jacket. I released her wrist, letting her arm drop limply to her side. The expensive crimson dress she wore suddenly seemed far too large for her shrinking frame. She slumped backward into the heavy mahogany dining chair, gasping for breath, as if the oxygen had been sucked entirely from the room. She kept her eyes fixed on the black smartphone resting safely in my palm. The room remained perfectly still. The federal agents blocking the exit did not move a single muscle. Gabriel watched me with silent, professional anticipation, knowing exactly what I was about to do. I did not hand the device over to the authorities just yet. I needed to ensure that this criminal network was completely eradicated from the ground up before I surrendered the physical evidence. I reached into the breast pocket of my tailored suit jacket and retrieved a small, heavy metal rectangular device. It was a military-grade, solid-state decryption drive. I had spent the last decade of my federal career building and refining the software architecture that powered these specific drives. I placed Vanessa's smartphone flat on the dining table right next to the empty folder that had once held my forged property deed. I plugged the decryption drive directly into the data port of her phone. A solid blue light pulsed twice on the metal casing, indicating a successful physical connection. I pulled a secondary cable from the drive and connected it to the master control panel of the restaurant smart screen. The massive digital display on the far wall flickered for a brief second, before casting a bright, harsh white glow over the stunned faces of the remaining dinner guests. The few hired actors who had played her wealthy family members sat completely paralyzed, too terrified of the federal agents blocking the door to make a single sound. Connor stood quietly a few feet away, watching the screen with profound focus, as the instrument of his near destruction was finally dismantled. Vanessa stared at the screen, her breath catching sharply in her throat. "You cannot bypass that level of encryption," she whispered, her voice trembling with a mixture of desperate hope and rising terror. "It requires a retinal scan and a localized biometric key. If you try to force the firewall, the motherboard will automatically melt the storage drive into useless slag." I did not look up from the table. I simply tapped a sequence of commands onto my tablet interface, syncing my terminal with the decryption drive. "That is a very impressive commercial security protocol, Vanessa," I replied, my tone calm and conversational. "It would certainly stop a local police detective or a standard private investigator. But you are not dealing with standard law enforcement. You are dealing with the man who wrote the foundational code for the Federal Asset Tracking Database. My drive is not trying to guess your password. I am forcing your device to recognize my terminal as its original host server." A progress bar appeared on the large screen, filling rapidly from left to right. It took exactly 14 seconds for the blue light on my drive to turn a solid, piercing green. The wall screen flashed, and suddenly, the entire digital contents of her smartphone were projected for the entire room to see. The interface displayed thousands of encrypted messages, hidden banking applications, and secure offshore network portals. I navigated through the file directory with practiced precision. I bypassed her personal communication folders and drilled straight down into the hidden partition of her storage drive. I was looking for the beating heart of her operation. It took me less than a minute to find the master ledger. I opened the file. A massive, complex spreadsheet populated the screen, containing thousands of rows of densely packed financial data. "This is not just a list of victims," I announced, my voice carrying a heavy weight as the guests stared at the wall. "This is the complete financial architecture of your entire syndicate. Here are the routing numbers, the proxy directors, the shell corporations, and the exact locations of every single offshore account your network uses to hide their stolen money." The spreadsheet contained the financial bloodline of her entire organization. I saw corporate accounts in the Cayman Islands, private trusts in Switzerland, and secured vaults in Cyprus. The total accumulated wealth sat at exactly $42 million. Vanessa clamped her hands over her mouth, a quiet, wretched sob escaping her lips. The ledger was the holy grail of white-collar criminal investigations. It contained the names and account details of her superiors, her money launderers, and her enforcement teams. Exposing this document meant absolute total destruction for her entire organization. Gabriel took a step forward from the doorway, his eyes scanning the spreadsheet with intense focus. He understood that capturing the criminals was only half the battle. If we left the funds in play, the syndicate would use that money to bribe witnesses, hire elite defense teams, and eventually retaliate against my son, Douglas, he said, his voice echoing in the quiet dining room. "Can you execute a wire recall protocol from that terminal?" "I can." I confirmed, my fingers moving swiftly across my tablet. "I am initiating a federal override sweep right now. I am binding the offshore account routing numbers directly to the Department of Justice Secure Holding Trust. I initiated the command sequence. I bypassed the international banking delays by using the syndicate-owned automated laundering scripts against them. I essentially instructed their financial network to believe they were performing a routine internal consolidation transfer. On the massive wall screen, the balances of the offshore accounts began to move. "I want you all to watch this very closely," I instructed the room. The numbers shifted rapidly as millions of dollars were aggressively sucked out of the secure international vaults. I watched the accounts bleed out. 40 million, 30 million, 20 million. The money cascaded down the screen, routing through Gabriel Federal blockade and settling securely into the government holding trust. It took less than 3 minutes to completely wipe out a decade of organized extortion. The final balance on the screen hit absolute zero. The master ledger was completely empty. The syndicate was financially annihilated, down to the very last cent. Every dollar they had stolen, every dollar they had hoarded to protect themselves from prosecution, was gone. I severed the connection and unplugged my decryption drive, sliding it quietly back into my jacket pocket. Vanessa sat frozen in her chair. Her eyes were completely vacant, staring at the zero balance on the screen. The reality of her total ruin crashed over her. She had no money to hire elite defense attorneys. She had no hidden funds to orchestrate an escape. She was completely and utterly bankrupt. The arrogant predator who had sat at my dining table demanding my home was gone. She was nothing more than a ruined criminal facing decades in a federal penitentiary. I reached out to pick up her smartphone from the table, intending to hand the physical evidence over to Gabriel. As my fingers brushed the glass casing, the screen suddenly lit up. The device vibrated harshly against the polished mahogany wood, emitting a sharp electronic chime that pierced the heavy silence of the room. Because the phone was still mirrored to the restaurant projection screen, the incoming text message was displayed in massive glaring letters across the wall for everyone in the room to read. The message was sent from an untraceable encrypted number. It contained exactly 2 sentences. "You exposed the network. You are a dead woman." Vanessa slowly raised her head, looking away from the wall and staring directly into my eyes. The color completely vanished from her face, leaving her skin a sickly, translucent white. Her entire body began to tremble violently. The fear radiating from her was no longer about going to prison. It was a primal, absolute terror of a woman who realizes she is no longer just facing a judge and a jury. She realized she had just handed the federal government the keys to her entire criminal empire. She had burned the powerful people she worked for. She was now the primary target of her own ruthless syndicate. The glowing words on the massive dining room screen cast a sickly pale light over Vanessa. She stared at the death threat from her own syndicate, and for a fleeting moment, I saw the absolute terror of a woman who knew she had nowhere left to run. But professional grifters do not simply surrender to their fate. They adapt. They manipulate. When the truth corners them, they build an entirely new reality out of thin air. Gabriel Foster gave a curt nod to the 2 federal agents standing at his side. They stepped fully into the private dining room, moving with the heavy, synchronized precision of men accustomed to taking down dangerous targets. The distinctive clack of metal handcuffs being drawn from a tactical belt echoed sharply against the quiet crystal and china of the restaurant. That sound snapped Vanessa out of her paralyzed trance. The terror vanished from her eyes, instantly replaced by a brilliant, flawless performance of desperate victimization. She threw herself backward, stumbling over her own crimson dress, and collapsed onto the polished wooden floor. She began to weep. It was not the dry, frustrated sobbing of a defeated criminal. It was a torrential, agonizing display of pure vulnerability. Real tears flooded down her cheeks, ruining her expensive makeup. Her chest heaved with violent, manufactured panic. "Help me!" she screamed, pointing a trembling, manicured finger directly at my chest. "Please, somebody help me. This man is out of his mind. He assaulted me. He physically attacked me and stole my phone." The hired actors sitting at the table remained absolutely frozen, too terrified of the federal agents to participate in her sudden charade. Connor stood a few feet away, watching her performance, with a look of profound disgust, finally seeing the monster behind the beautiful mask he had loved. But Vanessa did not care about her ruined audience. She was playing entirely to the law enforcement officers entering the room. "He is a psychotic, delusional old man," she wailed, shrinking back against the wall and wrapping her arms around her knees defensively. "He has been stalking me. He fabricated all of those bank records on the screen to ruin my wedding. He trapped us in this room and twisted my arm to steal my purse. Look at my wrist, he bruised me. I demand that you arrest him right now." At that exact moment, the heavy oak doors at the back of the dining room were pushed open again. 4 uniformed officers from the local city police department filed into the room, backing up Gabriel and his federal team. The local lead detective, a seasoned veteran with graying hair and tired eyes, stepped forward to assess the chaotic scene. He looked at Vanessa weeping hysterically on the floor, then turned his gaze toward me. I was standing perfectly still, projecting absolute calm, and holding her smartphone loosely in my hand. She continued her frantic screaming, begging the local officers to protect her from my violent delusions. She spun a rapid, breathless tale about how I was suffering from severe dementia and had hired hackers to project fake evidence on the wall out of pure paranoid spite. It was a masterclass in psychological manipulation. A lesser man might have panicked. A normal citizen might have raised his voice trying to aggressively defend himself against her lies. I did nothing of the sort. I knew that reacting to her hysteria would only validate her performance. I calmly reached into my tailored suit jacket and withdrew a slim digital tablet. I did not speak to Vanessa. I did not even look at her. I stepped forward and presented the tablet directly to the lead local detective. "Detective?" I said, my voice smooth and utterly devoid of emotion. "I understand that federal agents are here to execute outstanding warrants for wire fraud, identity theft, and corporate extortion. However, I believe your local jurisdiction takes immediate precedent regarding a much more severe matter." The detective took the tablet from my hands, looking at me with a mixture of skepticism and curiosity. "What exactly am I looking at here, sir?" he asked. "You are looking at the master bathroom of my private residence, recorded exactly 1 week ago on Thanksgiving Day," I replied. "The camera is concealed behind a ventilation grate. The footage is date-stamped and time-coded." I tapped the play button on the screen. The high-definition video began to roll. The volume was turned up, completely cutting through Vanessa fake sobbing. The video clearly showed her sneaking into my private bathroom wearing her pristine cashmere coat. The detective watched closely as the digital version of Vanessa opened my medicine cabinet. He watched her pull out my prescribed heart medication. He watched her dump the life-saving pills into the toilet and flush them away. He watched her reach into her own pocket, produce a secondary plastic bottle, and replace my medication with identical-looking pills. "These were high-dose industrial sedatives," I explained quietly while the video played. She intended to chemically induce symptoms of severe cognitive decline to facilitate a fraudulent medical power of attorney. Had I ingested the altered dosage given my medical history, the sedatives would have caused complete respiratory failure within hours. The detective stopped the video. The skeptical look in his eyes was entirely gone, replaced by the cold, hard gaze of a man looking at a lethal predator. He handed the tablet to one of his uniformed officers as evidence. He turned away from me and walked slowly toward Vanessa, who was still sitting on the floor. Her fake tears had stopped completely. She stared at the tablet in the officer's hands, the horrifying realization sinking in that I had been watching her every single move since the very beginning. "The federal charges for financial extortion will have to wait for the grand jury," the lead detective announced, his voice echoing with absolute finality. "Rachel Lawson, you are under arrest by the local authorities. The charge is attempted murder in the first degree." 2 uniformed officers moved forward immediately, grabbing her by the arms and hauling her roughly to her feet. The delicate facade she had maintained for months shattered violently. She thrashed against their grip, kicking and screaming obscenities as they slammed her against the nearest wall to secure her hands. The loud, sharp click of the steel handcuffs locking around her wrists signaled the absolute end of her criminal empire. She stopped struggling as the metal bit into her skin. She turned her head, her hair falling wildly across her face, and locked her venomous eyes onto mine. The pure hatred radiating from her was palpable. "You are a monster," she spat, her voice a vicious, guttural hiss. "You set me up. You are a sick, twisted psychopath." I did not back away from her rage. I took 3 slow, deliberate steps forward, completely invading her personal space. The police officers held her firmly against the wall, allowing me to step within inches of her face. I looked deep into her panicked, predatory eyes, and I dropped the folksy, harmless old man persona entirely. I leaned in close so only she could hear my words over the ambient noise of the room. "You thought you found a pathetic, lonely widower to subsidize your syndicate," I whispered, my voice carrying the freezing weight of a 30-year career hunting ghosts just like her. "You thought you were the smartest person in the room, but you never bothered to investigate where my money actually came from." Vanessa breathed heavily, her eyes darting across my face, looking for any sign of weakness. I let the silence hang for a fraction of a second before delivering the final psychological blow. "I retired with a personal net worth exceeding $80 million, I whispered, "and I did not earn a single cent of it by being a victim. For 3 decades, I was the chief forensic auditor for a covert federal task force. My entire professional existence was dedicated to hunting down corporate predators, dismantling international extortion rings, and burying arrogant criminals exactly like you underneath mountains of federal indictments. You did not target a helpless old man, Rachel. You walked blindly into the jaws of an apex predator." I watched the last shred of defiance leave her body, the color completely drained from her face, leaving her skin a sickening, translucent pale. Her breath caught in her throat as the sheer magnitude of her mistake finally registered in her mind. She realized she had not just failed a job. She had actively chosen to hunt the one man on Earth uniquely qualified to destroy her entire existence. Her eyes, wide with absolute bottomless terror, broke contact with mine. She dropped her head, staring at the floorboards, completely physically and mentally broken. I took a step back, adjusting the cuffs of my tailored suit. "Take her away," I told the detective, turning my back on her forever. The flashing red and blue lights of the police cruisers painted the dining room windows in chaotic strokes as we walked out the front doors of the restaurant. I did not look back. I did not need to see the remnants of the criminal syndicate being loaded into the back of armored federal vehicles. The cold November wind hit us the moment we stepped onto the sidewalk, but this time it did not feel bitter. It felt clean. It felt like breathing for the first time in what seemed like an eternity. I walked next to Connor, guiding him gently by the shoulder. My son moved like a man walking through thick mud. His body was physically present, but his mind was wandering through the wreckage of his own life. The adrenaline that had kept him standing during the confrontation was completely gone, leaving behind a hollow, exhausting emptiness. He had just witnessed the woman he planned to marry morph into a federal fugitive. He had seen the absolute destruction of his reality, and the shame of his own gullibility was weighing on him heavier than gravity. We reached my sedan, parked a block away. I unlocked the doors and Connor slid into the passenger seat without a single word. He pulled the seatbelt over his chest and leaned his head against the cold glass of the window, staring out into the dark city streets. I started the engine and turned the heater on high, letting the warm air fill the cabin. I did not ask him how he felt. I did not offer him empty platitudes about how time heals all wounds. When a man survives a psychological war, the last thing he needs is a lecture. He needs silence, and he needs safety. The drive back to the rustic house took over an hour. The rhythmic hum of the tires against the asphalt was the only sound between us. I watched him from the corner of my eye. His hands were folded in his lap, his knuckles white. He was replaying every conversation, every smile, every fake memory, trying to find the exact moment he should have known she was a predator. It is a terrifying loop to be trapped in. You question your own sanity. You question your ability to trust another human being ever again. I knew that feeling intimately. I had seen it in the eyes of countless victims over my 30-year career. We turned down the long, winding dirt driveway, and the heavy iron gates parted for us automatically. The cabin emerged from the dark woods looking exactly as it had on Thanksgiving Day, but the sinister shadow that Vanessa had cast over it was entirely gone. I parked the car, and we walked up the wooden steps to the front porch. When we stepped inside, the familiar scent of cedar and old books welcomed us. I took off my tailored suit jacket and draped it over the coat rack, returning to the simple man my son had always known. Connor took off his shoes and walked slowly into the dining room. He stopped at the edge of the large oak table. It was the exact spot where he had sat just days ago, terrified and isolated. It was the exact spot where he had knocked his napkin to the floor and flipped his coffee mug upside down to beg for his life. He stared at the smooth, polished wood, his chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. "Go sit down, son," I told him, my voice soft and reassuring. "I will make us something to drink." I walked into the kitchen and turned on the small light above the stove. I did not use the cheap instant coffee I usually kept on the counter for appearances. I opened a locked cabinet and pulled out a bag of rich, dark roasted beans I saved for special occasions. I ground the beans by hand, the mechanical grinding sound filling the quiet house. I boiled the water and prepared 2 large ceramic mugs, pouring the dark liquid slowly. The rich, earthy aroma began to chase the sterile smell of the restaurant from my senses. I carried the 2 steaming mugs into the dining room and placed one gently in front of Connor. I pulled out my chair and sat down across from him. I did not sit at the head of the table. I sat directly opposite him as an equal. Connor wrapped his hands around the warm ceramic, letting the heat seep into his pale fingers. He stared at the dark liquid for a long time before he finally spoke. His voice was fragile, barely above a whisper. "I am so stupid, Dad." He said, a single tear slipping down his cheek and falling onto the table. "I gave her everything. I gave her my passwords, my bank accounts, my trust. I let her walk into your house and insult you to your face. I was completely blind. I thought she loved me, but she was just measuring me for a coffin. How could I be so incredibly stupid?" I took a slow sip of my coffee, letting the warmth settle in my chest. I looked at my son with profound, absolute respect. "You are not stupid, Connor," I replied, my voice steady and unwavering. "You are empathetic. You are trusting, and you possess a good heart. Those are not weaknesses. Those are the best parts of who you are." The woman you met was a professional. She has spent her entire adult life learning how to mimic human emotion to manipulate good people. She studies psychology, she studies body language, and she knows exactly what strings to pull to isolate her targets. Connor looked up, his eyes red and searching. "But I should have seen the signs," he argued, his voice cracking with lingering guilt. "I should have known something was wrong before she trapped me in that fake loan." I leaned forward, resting my arms on the oak table. "Predators like her do not show their teeth until the cage is already locked," I explained. "They camouflage themselves as your perfect partner. They agree with your dreams, they validate your insecurities, and they slowly separate you from anyone who might tell you the truth. By the time the trap closes, you are too confused and terrified to fight back. You did nothing wrong, Connor. You survived. And when you realized you were drowning, you flipped that mug. You reached out for help. That takes an immense amount of courage." Connor absorbed my words, letting the heavy, suffocating guilt slowly begin to lift from his shoulders. He took a long drink of his coffee, closing his eyes, as the warmth grounded him back in reality. He sat back in his chair, looking around the quiet, safe dining room. Then he looked back at me, his expression shifting from sorrow to a deep, bewildered curiosity. "Dad," he asked, his voice returning to its normal cadence. "How did you know what to do? You did not just call the police. You froze offshore accounts. You pulled encrypted federal records. You hacked a phone in a matter of seconds. You orchestrated a tactical takedown of a professional criminal syndicate, and you did it without breaking a sweat. How is that even possible? You were an accountant for a paper company." I set my mug down on the table and let out a soft, genuine chuckle. The cover story I had maintained for decades had worked flawlessly, but it was finally time to put it to rest. I looked at the boy I had protected my entire life and decided he was finally ready to meet the man I truly was. "Come with me," I said, standing up from the table. "There is something I need to show you." Connor stood up, leaving his coffee behind, and followed me down the hallway. We walked past the living room and stopped in front of the hall closet. I pushed aside the heavy winter coats and placed my bare palm against the back wooden panel. The biometric scanner read my print, and the heavy mechanical lock unlatched with a loud, solid click. The panel swung open, revealing the dark, narrow stairwell. Connor gasped, taking a step back in shock. He had grown up in this cabin and never once realized there was a hidden passage behind the coats. I flipped the light switch and led him down the stairs. The air grew cooler, smelling of metal and electricity. When we reached the bottom of the stairs, we stood in front of the massive steel vault door. I entered a 6-digit passcode into the keypad and turned the heavy iron wheel. The door groaned as it swung outward. We stepped into the basement command center. The server racks hummed quietly in the background, the curved monitors glowing softly on the mahogany desk. But I did not point to the computers. I directed Connor's attention to the long concrete wall on the far side of the room. The wall was completely covered in framed documents. There were no family photos or landscape paintings. It was a mosaic of a 30-year shadow career. Connor walked slowly toward the wall, his eyes wide with absolute disbelief. He reached out, tracing his fingers over the thick glass frames. He read the official commendations from the Department of Justice signed by 3 different attorneys general. He saw the polished silver badges from multi-agency federal task forces. He read the classified intelligence citations awarding me for the successful dismantling of international money laundering rings, cartel financial networks, and corporate extortion syndicates. "You are not an accountant," Connor whispered, his voice echoing in the quiet steel room. "You were hunting these people." I stood behind him, looking at the physical evidence of my life's work. "I did not hunt street criminals." "Connor," I replied, my voice calm and absolute. "I hunted the monsters who wore tailored suits and hid behind corporate firewalls. I spent 30 years tracking the most dangerous financial predators on the planet. I retired to this cabin to give you a peaceful, normal life. But when that woman sat at our dining table and threatened my son, she brought the war to the wrong house." The quiet hum of the basement servers filled the space between us. Connor stood frozen before the concrete wall, completely captivated by the framed federal commendations and silver task force badges that documented my hidden life. I watched him trace the edge of a classified intelligence citation with a trembling finger. The profound shock in his eyes slowly gave way to a deep, grounding clarity. The fragile, vulnerable father he thought he had to protect had never existed. In my place stood a man who had spent 3 decades navigating the darkest corners of the global financial underworld. I told him that the secrets were officially over. I had built a quiet life to shield him from the predators I hunted, but I realized my silence had only left him blind to the wolves circling his own life. I promised him that we would never walk in the dark again. Connor turned to me, and the lingering shadows of guilt and manipulation were completely washed away from his face. He did not look at me with fear. He looked at me with a profound, quiet understanding. We walked back up the narrow, hidden stairwell and closed the heavy oak paneling behind us. The rustic cabin felt entirely different now. It was no longer a stage for a deceptive performance. It was an absolute fortress. 3 days later, the secure, encrypted phone on my mahogany desk vibrated with an incoming call. I answered the line, and Gabriel Foster spoke with a tone of absolute triumph. The federal sweep was a complete and total success. The master ledger I had extracted from the smartphone provided the Department of Justice with everything they needed to dismantle the extortion syndicate from the ground up. Gabriel detailed how tactical strike teams had executed simultaneous raids across 5 different states and coordinated with international authorities to freeze dozens of offshore holding trusts. The actors who had played the fake parents were apprehended trying to cross the northern border. The muscle who had fled my driveway were captured hiding in a cheap motel. As for the woman who called herself Vanessa, she was currently sitting in a maximum security federal holding facility. Gabriel explained that when the federal agents presented her with the decrypted contents of her own ledger, she completely broke down. She realized her superiors had abandoned her, and the government had seized every single dollar she had stolen over a 10-year criminal career. She was facing 70 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole. Gabriel told me the threat to my family was permanently eradicated. The roots of the syndicate had been pulled from the earth and burned to ash. I relayed the brilliant news to Connor, who was sitting on the living room sofa. A massive weight visibly lifted from his chest. He took a long, deep breath, closing his eyes as the final remnants of his anxiety faded into nothingness. But my son did not simply want to forget the nightmare and return to his old software firm. The psychological war he had survived fundamentally changed him. He realized that the world was full of predators who targeted the innocent, and he realized he possessed the exact technical skills needed to stop them. A month later, I officially established a private forensic auditing consultancy, operating strictly through encrypted networks right out of my basement command center. I did not take corporate clients or publicly advertise. I specifically accepted cases involving elderly victims and families being targeted by sophisticated financial predators. And I did not do it alone. Connor moved his primary workstations into the vault and joined me. Over the next 11 months, I taught my son everything I knew about the shadow economy. I taught him how to read between the lines of sanitized tax returns, how to track ghost money through international borders, and how to identify the behavioral patterns of professional extortionists. Connor was a brilliant student. He took my decades of field experience and combined them with his mastery of modern software development. He wrote custom tracking algorithms that could pierce through cryptocurrency tumblers in a matter of minutes. He engineered digital traps that made my old federal methods look completely antiquated. I remember the first time he successfully cornered a fraudster. We were tracking a group siphoning retirement funds from a local charity. Connor did not just block their transfer. He reverse-engineered their entire network, mapped their physical locations, and handed a perfect digital dossier to the local authorities all before lunch. I watched the soft-hearted boy, who had been paralyzed by fear, transform into a cold, calculating, and utterly relentless apex predator. We became a flawless two-man task force operating quietly in the dark to protect those who could not protect themselves. The seasons slowly changed, turning the deep green leaves of the upstate woods into brilliant shades of autumn orange and gold. Exactly 1 year after the nightmare began, my cabin was once again filled with the rich, savory smell of a roasting turkey and fresh cedar. The freezing November wind howled outside the heavy windows, but inside the house it was incredibly warm and completely safe. I set the dining room table with simple white plates and polished silver. There were only 3 chairs pulled up to the oak wood this time. I walked to the front door and opened it to welcome our only guest. Gabriel Foster stepped onto the porch carrying a bottle of vintage wine. He was not wearing his sharp federal prosecutor's suit. He wore a thick, comfortable sweater and a warm, genuine smile. He was not here as an operative tonight. He was here as family. We sat around the table sharing a quiet, peaceful meal. There was no polite, deceptive laughter echoing off the walls. There were no calculating eyes scanning my property. There was only the comfortable, easy conversation of 3 men who trusted each other with their lives. We talked about baseball, about the harsh winter weather approaching, and about the recent success of our private consultancy. Connor laughed loudly at a story Gabriel told about his early days at the agency. My son looked healthy, strong, and completely unburdened. His skin was flush with color, and his eyes were bright with genuine confidence. As the evening wound down and the fire crackled softly in the stone hearth, I carried a fresh pot of dark roasted coffee into the dining room. I poured a steaming cup for Gabriel and then filled the mug sitting in front of my son. The rich, earthy aroma drifted through the warm air, settling over the room like a comforting blanket. I took my seat at the head of the table and watched Connor wrap his hands around the warm ceramic. He took a slow, satisfied sip of the dark liquid, letting out a quiet sigh of absolute contentment. He lowered the cup to the table. He did not rush. He moved with the deliberate, steady grace of a man who was in total control of his own world. He placed the mug perfectly flat on the polished oak wood, exactly right side up. I looked at the mug sitting securely on its base, and a profound, quiet peace washed over my soul. The silent signal for desperation and terror was no longer needed in this house. The invisible cage had been completely destroyed. I leaned back in my chair, looking at the capable, brilliant man my son had become. I had protected my bloodline. I had annihilated the parasites who tried to feed on our vulnerability. I had passed on a legacy of strength and justice that would outlive me for decades to come. The long shadow of fear was permanently banished, and the only thing left in the room was absolute, untouchable freedom. The most profound lesson I learned from this ordeal is that the most dangerous predators do not hide in dark alleys. They sit at our dining tables wearing perfect smiles and tailored coats. True family is not defined merely by polite appearances or shared holidays, but by the absolute, unwavering trust you share when the world turns hostile. We often mistake vulnerability for weakness, but as Connor showed, having the courage to ask for help when you are drowning is the ultimate strength. Wealth can buy comfort and security, but it can never replace the fierce, unshakable loyalty required to protect the people you love. If this story of justice and family resilience resonated with you, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments below.